You might be forgiven if you closed your eyes and had missed the general election. Perhaps some of you wish you had. Then you might be forgiven to thinking, what's this? What's going to be on the news this evening? TV bulletins featuring a Home Secretary on an illegal migration raid, on a midnight bust, cracking the illegal migration gangs, talking tough, trying to, as much as they possibly can, trying to chase Nigel Farage, the Pied Piper of British politics. You may, if you close your eyes and woken up, be forgiven for thinking that Rishi Sunak was still in number 10 Downing Street. But of course, he isn't. We have a Labour government, which in many ways this morning is sounding like a Conservative one. But isn't that part of the point? And maybe that is part of the problem. You'll have seen this morning that Keir Starmer's government has been accused of trying to mimic Nigel Farage's Reform Party by publishing videos of raids on migrants accused of working illegally in Britain. Release of the footage is due to be part of a crackdown on those entering the country illegally. And it, as I say, echoes similar initiatives by Rishi Sunak's Tory government that were criticised at the time, funnily enough, by Labour and by others. The raids are being publicised as the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper's landmark Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill returns to its Parliament for its second reading in the Commons today. But the films have been criticised by human rights groups and MPs for being melodramatic. Among others, the Refugee Council has said that the government is using performative stunts to try to promote division. Former Green Party leader Caroline Lucas has said it was sickening trying to see Labour appeasing reform. And I think part of the conversation I want to have on this, as we always try and do on this show, of course, is to be as nuanced as possible. And I think you can kind of break this down, both into the kind of the why they're doing it for political reasons, which I think are good and bad. And I want to break down why I think that is and try and sort of take you along with me on this. I think it is important. Look, there is, I think, a bit of a fallacy sometimes, a bit of a fallacy which has gripped part of the left, part of liberalism, that it is somehow inherently right-wing or inherently authoritarian to be tough on illegal migration and even to be, at times, tough on border policy in general. There is nothing, in fact, that is intrinsically left-wing, intrinsically liberal, certainly about cracking down on illegal migration. Indeed, the solidarity on which any kind of social democratic, liberal system depends relies on a sense from the population at large that the rules are being observed and enforced. The problem, the gap that creeps in, the void that hard right, populist right, far right, whatever it happens to be, the gap that is filled by those forces takes place and occurs when there is a perception that those rules are not being enforced. For my money, in my assessment, Britain is a very decent, tolerant country, which actually is very open. Much of the population, not all, obviously, some people are always going to be nativist and unpleasant, but much of the population is up for a conversation, a reasonable conversation about migration, and is far more aware and open to a discussion of the trade-offs than politicians would give them credit for. What it is not open to, and what it is certainly a problem if it is manipulated by the far right or the hard right or whatever it is, what it is certainly not open to is manipulation of the system for and by criminals. And certainly not open to a manipulation from groups of people who are not following the rules. So in a sense, I actually disagree with Caroline Lucas and others. I don't have that much of a problem, personally, with the government sending a very clear signal, as it's clearly trying to do, that they will not tolerate illegal migration and these gangs need to be cracked down upon. I think everybody from left to right can agree with that. I've spent time investigating, reporting on these criminal gangs, these people smugglers. They are some of the worst scum of the earth. They trade and peddle on human suffering via the vehicle of human hope. And very often, they know what they're doing. They put people, women, children, babies into overcrowded, barely afloat little rubber dinghies, and they send them off on one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, i.e. the English Channel, and everywhere else as well. And they charge a fortune for the privilege. So no one, left to right, should have any truck with those people. That's not to say that the people that they're ferrying over aren't all legitimate refugees. I've interviewed them. Some of them most definitely are. Some won't be. But nonetheless, no one from left or right, in my view, should have any truck with these people. So I have no problem in particular with the government alighting upon this. The question is why they're doing it. And they're doing it clearly because right now in British politics, Nigel Farage and the populist right are playing and calling all of the tunes and the shots. Farage is the Pied Piper of British politics. He is, despite the fact he only has 5 MPs, despite the fact that he's not consistently leading in the polls, albeit he's certainly first, second or third, depending on which poll you look at, he has both Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer running after him. He is setting the terms of political trade. So the question is leaving aside the rights or wrongs of whether liberalism or left-wing forces or whatever you want to call it can be, should be, being performative on these matters, sending a signal to voters that they get it. The question is whether it will be effective. And on that, I am not so sure. Because the truth is that there is two ways of looking at this, and it's part of the thing I want to talk to you about. One view is the one I've just articulated, which I basically think is right, but I'm not sure, which is that it is important in an era where there is a huge amount of concern about these matters for the government, particularly a left-wing government, to send a signal they get it. On the other hand, there is another way of looking at it, which is that the more that you play into this narrative, the more that you follow Farage, the more you play on his turf, on his terrain, the more likely you are to lose. That Labour is never going to be viewed as being as tough on immigration as reform. That's just a losing political battle. No matter what you do, you're never going to be seen as tough as Farage is. And Farage will always move the goalposts. And therefore, focusing on it, this is the argument, increases the salience of the issue that reform wants to talk about. And many of the voters who are most opposed to these matters, to migration and so on, are never going to be persuaded. And I think that is a fair challenge, and it is entirely possible that is where Keir Starmer will end up. That the more you do things like this, the more likely you are to simply empower Farage and the very arguments that you're talking about. Now, for my money, I think it is possible to do two things at once. I think it is possible to put more than two thoughts or more than one thought in voters' heads at any given time. And I think it is possible and indeed desirable, as I say, for a left-wing government to send a signal to people that they get it about illegal migration, that they get it when they think and they see that there are people who are manipulating the system, and that has to have, from a government, there must be no tolerance of any of that. But I think at the same time it is possible to take a breath, to add something in parenthesis, to have a second sentence. And it's the second sentence which I think never comes and is the problem, which is this. Yes, illegal migration. Yes, of course, it's a problem. But it is a drop in the proverbial ocean in terms of the migration we're seeing overall. And it's the migration we're seeing overall that I think a left-wing government or a Labour government should draw a line in the sand with Farage over, and it's what they don't. Because we never get that second sentence, which is, okay, Nigel Farage, you want to crack down on migration. What do you want to crack down on? Let's take the latest figures. We never hear the actual figures, do we? Let's take the latest figures. Of the latest net migration figures, we had 500,000 work-related visas issued in 2023. What were the key sectors? Health and social care, with a significant portion of those work visas going to healthcare professionals and to social care professionals. Do you want to not let them in? Do you want to let people's nans and granddads have no one to look after them in their social care settings, their social care homes, or when they go into an NHS hospital? Then we have another big group, which is tech and finance, skilled workers in IT, finance and engineering. We've got a growth problem. We want to say no to skilled workers in IT, finance and engineering. Then we have another big group, which is hospitality and agriculture, seasonal workers for farms and hospitality roles. You want to say to Britain's tourism industry or Britain's farmers who are already struggling. You've been on the radio this morning complaining about what the Labour government is doing to farming. You want to tell people and farmers that they're not going to have anyone to pick the fruit and pick the vegetables this harvest time? Well, what's the answer? And then from on top of that, you have 486 study visas issued in 2023. Are you going to say to universities, which are on their knees, which don't have enough money right now, that they can't bring in these foreign students who pay a fortune, by the way, and increase Britain's soft power? And actually, most British people wouldn't even consider students to be migrants in the traditional sense. Which of those are you going to send back? And on it goes. And in fact, if you're looking at asylum seekers, that's only 74,000 in 2023. A tiny number of the overall proportion. That's not to say we shouldn't do something about it. It's not to say that we shouldn't tighten the border where appropriate. But we need, in my view, that second breath. We need that question to Nigel Farage and to others saying we should basically stop all migration. Which of those groups would you stop? Because there are trade-offs here. And my view is that the British public, not the bit of the public that are going to vote for reform come what may. Keir Starmer, you're never going to persuade those people. But I think a lot of the people listening to this show, reasonable people are open to that conversation about trade-offs. Which of those groups do you not want to let in? And yes, there are trade-offs by letting them in because we've got housing pressures, NHS pressures. I get all of that, schooling pressures. But migration is about trade-offs. And the thing is, you can release and you can publish those gangs and you can publish the videos of gangs being busted and all of that. Good, great. But where's that second sentence? Where Nigel Farage, or indeed anybody listening to this show who says that all of those numbers should come down, where should we make the cuts? Nigel Farage was in fact speaking to Nick Ferrari this morning on all of this. This is what he had to say.
If there were by-elections in the north of England, I think Reform would be in a very strong chance to win them. We've had a phenomenal few months with momentum behind the party. We hit our 200,000th paid-up member yesterday, and you know what? We're coming for that Labour vote. All the journalists talk about the rivalry between me and Kemi, Badenoch and Boris and all the rest of it. The truth is, it's the Labour vote we're after, and that's where our big gains are coming.
So I want to talk to you about whether you think it is that Labour are simply acting scared of Nigel Farage, and whether it is that by talking tough on migration and immigration, they can actually diffuse Farage, or are they actually just strengthening him? Or do you think that actually, as I say, there is nothing left-wing or liberal about not wanting to tackle migration, that it's Labour people it affects most?